The courtroom was quiet in that strange way it only gets when something feels wrong before anybody knows why. Judge Judy had seen thousands of people walk through those doors: liars, hustlers, angry ex-spouses, fake contractors, self-righteous landlords, people who came in rehearsed, people who came in terrified, people who came in thinking volume was a substitute for truth. But that morning, before a single word was spoken, something in the room shifted. It started with the woman on the defendant's side. She was very pregnant. Not a little pregnant, not the kind someone could miss if they were only half paying attention. She looked exhausted, swollen, and close enough to giving birth that even the bailiff stood a little straighter when she lowered herself carefully into the chair. Her coat was too thin for the weather. Her shoes were worn all the way down at the back. Her hair had been tied up fast, without a mirror. And in her hands, instead of a handbag or a folder full of papers, she carried one sealed white envelope. She held it the way people hold the last important thing they own. Across from her sat the plaintiff, a woman in a tailored ivory blazer with expensive earrings, perfect hair, and the upright posture of somebody who had spent her whole life making sure other people saw her before they heard her. Her name was Margaret Holloway, owner of Holloway House Florals and Events, known in her town as polished, respectable, and impossible to embarrass. She was suing the pregnant woman for $4,220. According to Margaret, the woman had stolen cash from the office safe, taken her SUV in the middle of the night, disappeared from the staff apartment she had been allowed to use, and left with a family heirloom pendant that had belonged to Margaret's mother. According to Margaret, this was not desperation. It was betrayal. The defendant's name was Elena Reyes, and unlike Margaret, Elena didn't come in ready to talk. She sat quietly, both hands resting over the envelope in her lap, as if the paper inside mattered more to her than the case itself. Judge Judy noticed that immediately. She also noticed that Elena didn't look at Margaret once, not once. That mattered too. The clerk called the case. Judge Judy glanced down at the complaint, then back up at the two women in front of her. "Miss Reyes," she said, eyes narrowing toward the envelope. "What's that?" Elena looked down at it, as if she had almost forgotten she was holding it. "It's a letter, Your Honor." Judge Judy leaned back a fraction. "I assumed that. What kind of letter?" Elena swallowed. "A personal one." Margaret let out a short, dry laugh from the plaintiff's side. Judge Judy cut her eyes toward her. "You'll get your turn." Then she looked back at Elena. "Why did you bring it?" Elena's fingers tightened very slightly around the envelope. "In case you didn't believe me." That changed the room. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. Judge Judy sat forward. "And what exactly is in this letter that would matter if I don't believe you?" Elena lifted her eyes. "The truth," she said quietly. "The part I didn't want to have to say out loud." Judge Judy held her gaze for a long moment. There was no trembling performance in the voice, no theatrical sniffing, no rushing to be pitied. If anything, Elena looked like a woman who had spent too much time trying not to speak. That got Judge Judy's attention. Then she turned to Margaret. "All right. You brought the lawsuit. Start talking." Margaret had clearly been waiting for that moment. She sat up straighter, smoothed one hand over the stack of paperwork in front of her, and launched into the story with the clipped confidence of somebody who had already told it enough times to sand it down into a shape she liked. Elena Reyes, she explained, had been working at Holloway House for nearly a year. She helped with floral prep, setup days, deep cleaning after weddings, and minor inventory runs. Elena had no stable residence when Margaret hired her, and because Margaret had felt sorry for her situation, she had allowed Elena to stay in the tiny studio above the rear storage garage behind the event warehouse. "It was temporary," Margaret said. "A favor." Judge Judy lifted a brow. "A favor? Yes? Paid or unpaid?" Margaret hesitated a fraction too long. "She paid a small amount when she could." Judge Judy made a note. "Continue." Margaret did. According to her, Elena had become more unreliable in the last 2 months. She was missing shifts, acting evasive, asking for cash advances, making excuses. Then one Friday night, everything fell apart. The emergency event cash envelope from the office was gone. Margaret's gray SUV was gone. So was Elena. And when Margaret later went to retrieve some jewelry from the private cabinet in her office, a sapphire pendant that had belonged to her late mother could not be found. The apartment over the garage had been half emptied. A few clothes were missing, some papers were gone, and Elena had vanished long enough, Margaret said, for the truth to be obvious. She stole from me and ran, Margaret said flatly. Now she's hiding behind that pregnancy and whatever sad story she's about to invent. Judge Judy turned slowly toward Elena. Did you take the cash? Yes. Margaret exhaled sharply, pleased with herself. Judge Judy didn't look at her. Did you take the SUV? Yes. Margaret almost smiled. And the pendant? That was the first question Elena didn't answer immediately. Judge Judy caught the pause. Well? Elena's hand moved to the bottom of her stomach. No. Margaret gave a disgusted laugh. Oh, of course. So now we're selecting which parts of the theft count. Judge Judy turned her head just enough to pin her in place. You are one interruption away from becoming annoying. Sit still. Then she faced Elena again. You admit taking the money. You admit taking the vehicle. You deny taking the pendant. Fine. Why did you take the money? Elena inhaled slowly. Because somebody needed medical help. Margaret rolled her eyes. She means herself. No, Elena said. It was still quiet, still controlled. But for the first time, there was a hard edge under it. Judge Judy heard that immediately. All right, she said. Who needed medical help? Elena's eyes dropped to the envelope again. I can't say it like that. Judge Judy's face hardened. We are not playing games. You're in court. Either you explain why you took somebody else's cash and vehicle in the middle of the night, or I make a very simple ruling based on the facts you've already admitted. Elena nodded once. I understand. If I say it wrong, it hurts somebody. Judge Judy didn't blink. At the moment, the person you've hurt appears to be the woman suing you. So let's hear it. Elena took a breath. Then she said the one sentence nobody in the room was prepared for. I took the cash and the car because your daughter was bleeding. Everything stopped. Margaret stared. Not outraged at first, just blank. Judge Judy leaned back slowly. My daughter? Margaret asked, sounding less angry than confused. Elena nodded once. Yes. Judge Judy looked from one woman to the other. How old is your daughter, Mrs. Holloway? Margaret answered automatically, still staring at Elena. 19. Name? Brooke. Judge Judy turned back. You're talking about Brooke Holloway? Yes. Margaret shook her head at once. That's impossible. My daughter was at school. Elena looked at her for the first time. No, she said quietly. She wasn't. And just like that, the case that had entered the room one way began to leave it another. Judge Judy picked up her pen. Miss Reyes, from the beginning. Slowly. Elena obeyed. She explained that Brooke had shown up at the floral warehouse 3 weeks before the incident, alone. Hoodie over her head, crying. She wasn't supposed to be home from college. She said she didn't want her mother to know she was there. She asked Elena for a place to sit for 15 minutes and ended up staying nearly 2 hours in the back prep room. Judge Judy asked the obvious question. Why, Elena? Elena answered, because I was the least dangerous person there. That line landed harder than most of what came before it. Margaret's face changed. Judge Judy noticed. Elena continued. Brooke had come back 2 more times after that. She was pale, frightened, and constantly checking her phone. She said she was in trouble. She said she couldn't tell her mother yet. She said her father knew and told her to keep her head down until he could work things out. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed. Work what out? Elena looked down. Her pregnancy. The room gave up its breath all at once. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. No, she whispered. Elena didn't correct her, didn't comfort her, didn't make it bigger than it already was. She simply kept going. On the night in question, Elena said, her phone rang at 2:07 a.m. It was Brooke. She was at a motel off Route 17. She was crying, bleeding, and said she thought something was very wrong. She begged Elena not to call her mother and not to call an ambulance. Why not? Judge Judy asked. Elena answered immediately, because she was terrified of what her father would do if the police got involved before he got there. Margaret looked like somebody had yanked the floor out from under her. Judge Judy asked, so you took the event cash and the vehicle? Yes. How much cash? About $800 from the emergency envelope. Margaret snapped. It was $1,200. Judge Judy didn't even look up. Did you count it before or after your story fell apart? Margaret went silent. Judge Judy continued. You drove to the motel? Yes. What did you find? Elena's voice lowered. Blood on the bathroom floor. Brooke sitting against the tub, barely able to stand. The room became very still. That kind of stillness can only happen when people stop wondering who's going to win and start worrying about what has already happened. Judge Judy asked, Did you take her to a hospital? Yes, St. Agnes. Why not use her insurance? Because she panicked and said if the card was run, her father would know before her mother did. Judge Judy made another note. Margaret looked like she was trying to breathe through a wall. Why wouldn't she call me? She whispered. Elena didn't answer. Judge Judy did. That's a question for your daughter and for yourself. Then she went back to the case. You took Brooke to the emergency room. Did they admit her? Yes. Was she pregnant? Elena closed her eyes for half a second. She had been. Margaret's face broke. For the first time since entering court, all the Polish left her at once. Not just the confidence, the control. The room was now staring at a mother who had learned, in front of strangers, that her daughter had gone through something catastrophic while she knew nothing about it. Judge Judy's tone shifted, not softer exactly, but more precise. What happened after the hospital? Elena swallowed. Her father showed up. Margaret's head jerked toward her. At the hospital? Yes. Judge Judy asked. At what time? A little after 6. And how would he know to come? Brooke's voice answered from the back of the courtroom before anyone else could. Because I texted him first. Every head turned. A young woman stood in the doorway wearing an oversized sweatshirt, no makeup, and the expression of someone who had spent too long rehearsing courage and still wasn't sure she had enough. Brooke Holloway looked nothing like the version of her that existed in Margaret's mind 5 minutes earlier. She looked thinner, older somehow, and terrified. Margaret actually stood halfway from her chair before sitting back down again. Brooke? Judge Judy didn't miss a beat. Come in. Brooke stepped forward slowly and sat where the bailiff directed her. Judge Judy looked at her over her glasses. You heard enough? Brooke nodded. Yes, ma'am. Good, then let's not waste time. Were you pregnant? Brooke shut her eyes briefly. Yes. Did Elena Reyes take you to St. Agnes Hospital in the middle of the night? Yes. Did she take your mother's SUV? Yes. Did she use cash from the event envelope? Brooke nodded again. Yes. Did she do those things to help you? Brooke's eyes filled immediately. Yes. Margaret made a sound that was almost a sob, but never fully became one. Judge Judy let it sit there. She did not rush to comfort her. This was information. Painful information, but information first. Did your mother know where you were that night? Brooke turned toward Margaret for the first time and shook her head. No. Did your father know? Brooke nodded. Yes. Did he tell you to keep it from your mother? Brooke's lips trembled. Yes. Margaret pressed both hands to the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing left in her world. Judge Judy asked the question that was beginning to matter more than the lawsuit. Why? Brooke answered, without looking at her mother. He said if Mom found out before the spring investor dinner, she would lose her mind, cancel the whole season, and everything would collapse. He said he needed a week to fix it. Judge Judy's face hardened at that word. Fix. Again, always the coward's favorite word. What exactly did he mean by fix it? She asked. Brooke's voice went quiet. He meant he was going to send me to my aunt in Arizona and tell everyone I was taking a semester off for stress. Margaret stared at her daughter as if she had never actually seen her before. And I agreed at first, Brooke said, crying now but forcing herself through it, because I was scared. And because I knew if Mom found out right away, it would be like detonating a bomb in the middle of everything. I didn't want to be the girl who ruined another event season, another dinner, another fundraiser, another perfect week. That line hit Margaret like a physical blow, because whatever else this case was, it was now very clearly about a house where appearances had become more important than honesty. Judge Judy didn't comment on that. She let the silence do it for her. Then she turned back to Brooke. What happened at the hospital? Brooke looked down. I lost the baby. No one moved. No one even looked at anyone else. That kind of grief doesn't need witnesses. It just acquires them. Judge Judy's voice stayed even. And after that? My father came. He talked to Elena outside. Then he told me he'd handle it. Elena's face didn't change, which somehow made her look more tired than if it had. Judge Judy asked, handle what? Brooke gave a small, broken laugh. Everything. That's what he always says. Then Judge Judy turned toward Elena. Did he speak to you outside the hospital? Yes. What did he say? Elena took a breath. He asked who knew. I said nobody. Then he said that was best for everyone. He said Brooke needed quiet, not scandal. And he reminded me I had taken money and a car, so if I decided to make things difficult later, there were plenty of ways the story could go. Margaret looked physically ill. You're saying my husband threatened you? Elena answered with brutal simplicity. Yes. And you still helped my daughter? That question came out of Margaret before she could stop it. It wasn't a legal question. It was a human one. Elena looked at her, and for the first time all morning there was visible pain in her face, not just exhaustion. Because she was 19 and bleeding, she said. That was bigger than your husband. That shut the room down all over again. Judge Judy let the silence remain for several seconds. Then she went to the loose end sitting in the center of the case. The pendant. Margaret's eyes moved slowly toward her. The lawsuit had already lost most of its shape, but that one allegation still remained. Judge Judy tapped the complaint. Mrs. Holloway says a sapphire pendant disappeared that same weekend. Did you take it? No? You know where it is? Elena did not answer immediately. That was enough. Judge Judy's eyes sharpened. You know? Yes. And? Elena looked from Brooke to Margaret and back again. If I say it, this case is over, she said. But your marriage may be too. The room didn't gasp this time. It froze in a deeper way. Margaret stared at Elena. What are you talking about? Elena turned to Judge Judy. Her husband pawned it. Margaret's face drained of color so fast it looked unreal. No. Elena nodded slowly. He came into the warehouse office on Wednesday before all this happened. Around 10:30 in the morning, he asked if anyone had seen the pendant. Then he said if anybody asked later, it had been sent out for cleaning. Judge Judy leaned forward. And why didn't you believe him? Because he smelled like bourbon before lunch, Elena said. And because he couldn't remember whether Mrs. Holloway wore it on a chain or pinned it. Judge Judy's brow lifted. That was a very hard detail to fake. Do you have proof? Elena reached carefully into the inner pocket of her coat. The bailiff shifted, but Elena froze and looked at Judge Judy first. It's a receipt. Judge Judy nodded. The pawn slip made its way to the bench. Judge Judy unfolded it, scanned it, then held it up. Pawned item. 1 sapphire pendant, white gold setting. Date. 3 days before the hospital night. Signature on the seller line, Thomas Holloway. Judge Judy looked directly at Margaret. Recognize your husband's signature? Margaret's lips parted, but it took her a moment to answer. Yes. It came out so quietly it barely sounded like speech. Judge Judy set the slip down. There's your pendant. Margaret stared at the paper like it was an obituary. Brooke looked sick, and the entire complaint, now stripped of its structure, lay in pieces on the table. No theft of the pendant, emergency use of the vehicle, cash taken to save Margaret's daughter. This was no longer a simple civil complaint. This was what happens when somebody wealthy writes the first version of the story and expects the truth to stay too embarrassed to challenge it. Judge Judy looked at Margaret. Do you still want this money from her? Margaret answered honestly this time, which was a first. I don't know what I want. Judge Judy nodded once. Fair enough, because I know what I want. I want your husband on the phone. Margaret didn't move. Judge Judy's voice sharpened. Now. Margaret fumbled with her phone, fingers suddenly uncooperative. She called once, no answer. Again, straight to voicemail. Then, as if the courtroom hadn't been rearranged enough already, Brooke spoke up before Judge Judy could. He won't answer her. Judge Judy turned. Why not? Brooke wiped at her face. Because he knows she only calls twice in a row when something's wrong. If she's calling like that, he knows the truth got there first. That was a very grown-up sentence from a 19-year-old. Too grown-up. Judge Judy heard that too. You sound like this isn't new. Brooke gave a hollow laugh. It isn't. Judge Judy leaned back. Explain. Brooke looked at Margaret, and for a second it seemed like she might stop. Like mercy might get in the way of accuracy, but then she looked at Elena, sitting there, swollen, exhausted, and still somehow protecting everyone in sight, and Brooke made a different choice. My father's been managing our family by controlling information for years, she said. Bills, vendor problems, lies about where money went, lies about why things were late, lies about who knew what. He always says it's temporary. He always says he's doing it so Mom can focus on the business. Margaret shut her eyes. Brooke continued. When I told him I was pregnant, he didn't hug me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked if anyone else knew. Then he said we needed a plan before Mom found out. Judge Judy asked, did he ever intend to tell your mother? Brooke's answer was immediate. No. Margaret was crying openly now. Not because her daughter had disappointed her, because she was learning she had been arranged around, managed, protected from the truth in a way that was actually just exclusion. Judge Judy looked back at the pawn slip. Do you know why he pawned the pendant? Brooke nodded reluctantly. Yes. The room somehow got quieter. He had gambling debt, she said, and he thought if he covered one payment he could stop before Mom noticed. But then he needed more. The pendant was fast cash. Margaret bowed her head. That was worse than an affair would have been. Not because of money, because of the familiarity of it, the planning, the hiding, the willingness to let someone else carry blame. Judge Judy asked Elena, why didn't you use the pawn slip earlier? Elena took a breath. Because he told me if I exposed him, Brooke would lose both parents in the same week, one to betrayal and one to shame. He said my life was already unstable, and I'd survive this easier than they would. Judge Judy's face hardened. And what did you say? That I wouldn't lie. And? He said I didn't need to lie, I just needed to stay quiet. That sentence hung in the room like smoke, because that was it, really. That was the whole moral ugliness of the thing. He didn't ask Elena to say something false. He asked her to say nothing true. And silence, in the hands of a coward, can be as cruel as any direct lie. Judge Judy glanced down at the envelope again. It was still sitting in Elena's lap, still unopened, still somehow heavier than the rest of the paperwork in the room combined. What's in the letter? She asked again. Elena hesitated. Brooke turned toward her. Margaret looked up too, red-eyed and shattered. Elena's voice came out low. It's for my baby, in case this ended before I got the chance to explain who I am. Judge Judy's face changed slightly. Explain that. Elena looked at the envelope. I wrote it after I got locked out of the apartment over the garage, after I realized there might not be a version of this where anyone ever believed me. I thought if I went into labor before this was over, or if something happened, I didn't want my daughter growing up with court papers and accusations and no truth of her own. That line passed through the room like grief looking for a seat. Judge Judy said nothing for a moment. Then, do you currently have somewhere to stay? Elena gave a tired smile that did not reach her eyes. Sometimes. Judge Judy hated that answer on sight. Translate. Elena looked down. A shelter if there's room. A church basement when they open overflow. One motel night last week because a cashier at the grocery store paid for it when she saw my ankles. Margaret covered her face again. Judge Judy looked at her sharply. This is the woman you sued. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Judge Judy's voice stayed even. She saved your daughter's life, carried your family's lie on her back, got evicted, lost her job, lost her housing, and is now within weeks of delivering a child while moving place to place. And you sued her. The only honest answer was the one Margaret gave. Yes. Judge Judy turned to Elena. Did you ever ask Mrs. Holloway for help after you were put out? No. Why not? Elena answered so quietly the whole courtroom leaned in. Because there are some people who only know how to help the version of you that stays grateful. Judge Judy stared at her for a long moment. That was not courtroom language. That was lived experience. Then she extended her hand. The letter. Elena went very still. Not scared exactly, exposed. It's one thing to tell a judge what happened, another to let strangers hear what you wrote when you thought only your child might ever know who you really were. Judge Judy softened by 1 degree. May I read it? Elena nodded. Yes, but all of it. All. She stood slowly, came forward, and placed the envelope in Judge Judy's hand. On the front, in careful blue handwriting, were the words, "For my daughter, if I'm called a thief." Judge Judy opened it. Inside was lined notebook paper, folded twice, written front and back. She began reading silently, then stopped. Looked up. Took off her glasses. That single movement changed the air in the room more than any outburst could have. Because Judge Judy did not take off her glasses for effect, she took them off when something became harder to keep at professional distance. When she spoke again, she read aloud. If you are hearing this, little girl, then somebody reached you before I did. The room fell still in a way that felt almost sacred. Judge Judy read on. If the first thing you ever learn about me is that I was homeless, please do not think that means I was careless. If the first thing you learn is that I was accused, please do not think that means I was guilty. If the first thing you hear is that I stayed quiet, please do not think that means I had nothing to say. Margaret's head bowed. Brooke started crying quietly. Judge Judy kept reading. I stayed quiet because another girl was already carrying more fear than a young body should hold. I stayed quiet because blood does not wait for permission and shame does not belong in an emergency room. I stayed quiet because I knew what it was to be young and in pain, and afraid that the first person who answered the phone would care more about appearances than survival. Judge Judy paused only once, enough to breathe, then continued. You may ask why your mother took money that wasn't hers. The answer is simple, because a cashier window asked for cash before kindness. You may ask why I took a car that wasn't mine. The answer is also simple, because pain did not arrive on a schedule that respected ownership. The courtroom had gone beyond silence now. This was not spectacle anymore. This was testimony from somewhere deeper than law. Judge Judy read the next line more slowly. You may hear that I lived in borrowed places, that I drifted, that I should have made better choices. Maybe I should have, but do not let anybody tell you that being poor means being less moral than the people with locked offices and family names on buildings. Some people commit worse thefts from inside cleaner homes. That line landed directly on Margaret, on Brooke, and on the absent man who had shaped this entire case without even showing up. Judge Judy turned the page. I wrote this because paper has a dangerous habit of becoming history when the wrong people get to write first. And women like me learn early that if we do not leave our own version somewhere, somebody richer will leave theirs for us. Judge Judy's voice tightened, not enough to break, enough to reveal feeling. Margaret was crying openly now. Brooke had both hands over her mouth. Elena stood beside the table, staring at the floor, unable to watch her own life be returned to her in someone else's voice. Judge Judy continued. I did not save that girl because I am brave. I saved her because years ago, nobody saved my sister. The room changed again. Judge Judy lowered the page slightly, then lifted it again and kept going. She was 17, alone, and too ashamed to ask for help until it was too late. By the time my mother found her, she had already lost too much blood. People called it a tragedy, but it was not a tragedy. It was a chain of pride, fear, silence, and delay, and every adult in that chain called themselves sensible. Brooke broke completely then, not with noise, with the kind of grief that folds a person inward. Judge Judy read the next lines with visible effort. So when Brooke called me from that motel bathroom, I did not hear a rich girl. I heard a terrified child in a body old enough to be blamed but too young to know how to save herself. And I made a decision. I decided that if someone would be ruined for that night, it would not be her. Margaret's shoulders shook. Judge Judy kept reading. I know what people think of women who are pregnant and poor. They think we are warnings. They think our lives are proof of failure. They think if something goes wrong near us, we probably caused it. So if all this ends badly, if people say I stole, if they say I used my condition for sympathy, if they say I manipulated a good family, then I want you to know this before the world gets to you first. Your mother was not trying to look innocent. She was trying to keep one more girl from becoming a ghost. By then, even the gallery had gone still in a different way. No shifting, no throat clearing, just people listening. Judge Judy turned to the last page. I have already named you in my head, she read. Your name is Lucia. It means light. I chose it because too much of this happened in rooms where the lights were on, and the truth was still being hidden. Judge Judy stopped for one breath. Then she read the final part. If Judge Judy ever reads this, I hope she knows I did not bring this letter for pity. I brought it because some truths are so poor they need help getting heard. My mother used to watch her every afternoon and say, that woman does not scare easy, and she does not like cowards. If she reads this, tell her I tried not to let cowardice choose for me. By the time she reached the last line, Judge Judy's voice was steady only because she forced it to be. The final sentence was short. If my daughter ever asks what kind of woman I was, tell her I stole blame, not mercy. Judge Judy lowered the paper, took a breath, removed her glasses fully, and held them in one hand. The room did not move, not Margaret, not Brooke, not Elena. Nobody. Because once a woman writes something like that for her unborn child, there is no dignified way to pretend it did not just alter every person present. Judge Judy looked first at Elena. You did not come here asking for pity. No, Your Honor. No, you came here because you expected the documents to beat you to your own story. Elena nodded, tears finally filling her eyes. Judge Judy turned to Margaret. This woman does not owe you money. She is the reason your daughter survived that night with dignity. Margaret broke into a sob and nodded. Judge Judy turned to Brooke. And you, she said, more gently than before, are not responsible for the men who turned your pain into a scheduling problem. Brooke cried harder at that, because it was the first time anyone had said it that cleanly. Then Judge Judy sat forward and delivered the legal part in the tone that had made her famous. The complaint is dismissed in its entirety. There it was, simple, final. No recovery for the plaintiff, no finding of theft with respect to the cash or vehicle under the emergency facts established here. No credible evidence that Miss Reyes took the pendant. In fact, the evidence strongly supports that your husband did. She looked at Margaret. If you want to understand how you arrived in my courtroom suing the wrong woman, start at home. Margaret nodded helplessly. Judge Judy wasn't done. Second, Mrs. Holloway, if there is any decency left to be done here, it is not going to happen by writing one check and calling yourself redeemed. Do you understand me? Yes. I said, do you understand me? Yes, Your Honor. Good. Because this woman is weeks from giving birth. She has no stable housing. She lost employment protecting your daughter. If you intend to make anything right, you will do it quietly, immediately, and without buying gratitude. Margaret cried as she answered. I will. Judge Judy snapped back. That wasn't permission to feel noble. That was instruction. Margaret lowered her head. Judge Judy turned to Elena. Do you want anything from her? It was an impossible question, and Elena looked it. Not revenge, not money, not exactly. She thought for a long moment. Then she said the one thing that proved she was exactly who the letter said she was. Help Brooke first, she said. Then help my baby not start where I'm ending. Brooke covered her face. Margaret shook with silent sobs. Judge Judy looked at Elena with something that was almost admiration. Then she said, you are going to stop carrying everybody else's catastrophe like it is your full-time job. A weak laugh escaped Elena through tears. Yes, Your Honor. I mean it. I know. Judge Judy folded the letter back carefully, slid it into the envelope, and held it out. Elena took it with both hands. Keep this, Judge Judy said, but I hope your daughter hears the story from you directly. Elena nodded. So do I. The case was over, legally at least, but some cases don't really end when the ruling is read. They end in the aisle, or in the parking lot, or 3 months later when somebody finally chooses not to go home to the same lie. Margaret stood before anyone told her to. For a second, it looked like she might try to hug Elena. She didn't. That would have been about Margaret. Instead, she stood there crying, one hand against her chest, and said the only thing she had a right to say. "I'm sorry." Elena looked at her for a long time, then answered in the only honest way she could. "I know. Not forgiveness, not rejection, just truth." Then Brooke stood too. She crossed the space between them and stopped directly in front of Elena. Her whole face crumpled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Elena touched her cheek lightly. "You were bleeding," she said. There was nothing to apologize for that night. Brooke shook her head hard. "For after." Elena's eyes softened. That answer, at least, she accepted. Judge Judy watched all of it without saying anything, because for once the room didn't need her to impose order. Truth had already done that. The bailiff started gathering the exhibits: the pawn slip, the complaint, the copies of the emergency withdrawal sheet, the papers that had once looked like a straightforward lawsuit and now looked like pieces of a badly staged lie. Margaret turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said, voice shaking, "may I ask one thing?" Judge Judy looked up. "One." Margaret looked at Elena, then down. "How do I help without making this worse?" Judge Judy answered immediately. "You start by telling your husband the hiding is over. Then you ask your daughter what she needs before you tell her what the family needs. Then you arrange housing for Miss Reyes that does not depend on employment, obedience, or gratitude. Then you pay every medical expense tied to that night and every prenatal expense she's carrying now if she'll allow it." Margaret nodded through tears. "I will." Judge Judy pointed a finger. "And if you turn this into some redemption performance, I'll be annoyed, and I'm already close." For the first time all morning, a few people in the room laughed softly. Even Elena did. It came out tired and surprised, but it was real. That mattered. Margaret wiped her face. "Understood." Brooke was still standing close to Elena. "You saved me," she whispered. Elena looked down at her stomach. "No," she said. "You called." That line nearly broke the room again. Judge Judy shifted the next case file in front of her, but she didn't open it yet. Instead, she looked one last time at Elena. "What did you say your baby's name was?" Elena blinked. "I haven't said." Judge Judy tilted her head. "You wrote it." Elena gave a small, embarrassed smile. "Lucia." "Light," Judge Judy said. Elena looked startled. "You know it?" Judge Judy snorted lightly. "I know many things. Don't seem so surprised." That got a slightly bigger laugh. Elena nodded, tears in her eyes all over again. "Yes, Light." Judge Judy's expression softened by exactly 1 degree. "Good name." Then she added, in the driest voice in the room, "Certainly better than naming her after me. You'd have to fill out too much paperwork." This time even Brooke laughed through tears. Elena smiled fully for the first time, and then the case was truly over, or so it seemed. 3 months later, an envelope arrived at the production office addressed simply to Judge Judy. No return request, no attempt at publicity, no note asking for money. Inside was a photograph of a newborn baby girl wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. On the back, in the same neat handwriting from the courtroom letter, were the words, "She came early, but she came loud. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Strong lungs. Angry eyebrows. Her name is Lucia Elena Reyes. Elena, because Light deserves witnesses. Thank you for hearing me before my daughter had to inherit my silence. Elena." The assistant who opened it brought it to Judge Judy between tapings. Judge Judy looked at the picture a long time, longer than anybody expected. Then she turned it over and read the note again, once, then a second time. And that afternoon, according to the staff who knew her best, she was even less patient than usual with people who hid behind paperwork. Because once you hear a woman write, "I stole blame, not mercy," you don't really go back to the version of the world you had before. That was why the case stayed with people. Not because a rich woman got embarrassed, not because a hidden pregnancy was revealed, not even because a lawsuit was dismissed. It stayed because the whole case had started with a familiar story, a comfortable story, a poor pregnant woman accused of theft by a respectable employer. Easy story, clean story, the kind that fits inside one sentence and asks for no thought. Then the truth arrived, and the truth was messier, costlier, and far more human. A homeless woman had used stolen cash to save a girl with more privilege than power. A mother who thought she knew her family learned she had been arranged around, not included. A daughter realized survival had made her trust the wrong parent. And a judge, who had heard every kind of excuse on earth, found herself reading a letter written by a woman who had expected to lose before she had the chance to explain who she was. That was the part people could not forget. Not the tears, the expectation behind the letter, the fact that Elena had sat down and written a defense of her own humanity to her unborn child because experience had taught her that if she didn't, no one else would do it honestly. That was what left Judge Judy in tears, not sentiment, recognition, because behind every dramatic case is usually a simpler cruelty. Some people get the benefit of context, others get accused first and understood never. Elena Reyes knew exactly which category she lived in. So she brought her own truth in an envelope, and when the room finally heard it, everybody understood the same thing at once. The real theft in that courtroom had never been the money. It had been the stolen version of Elena, the one written by somebody wealthier, safer, cleaner, and louder. By the time the next litigants were called in, the tables had been cleared, the exhibits removed, and the microphones reset. Everything looked normal again. That's what courtrooms do. They reset, but the people inside them don't always. Margaret did what Judge Judy told her to do. Not perfectly, not publicly, but she did it. Brooke moved out of her father's orbit. The housing arrangement for Elena was made quietly through a short-term rental owned by one of Margaret's event clients, paid 6 months in advance with no employment strings attached. The prenatal bills were covered, then the delivery bill, then a used crib appeared, then diapers, then formula coupons. Never enough to erase what had happened, enough to prove somebody had finally understood the difference between helping and controlling. As for Thomas Holloway, his problems had only just begun. But that part never needed to be in front of Judge Judy. Some consequences belong to a higher court than humiliation. The reason viewers talked about the case for so long was because of one line. People remembered different moments: the pawn slip, Brooke walking in, Margaret learning the truth, the dismissal. But the line that lasted was this: paper has a dangerous habit of becoming history when the wrong people get to write first. That was the whole case, the whole wound, the whole country in some ways. A woman with a thinner coat, a fuller stomach, and fewer resources had to come into court carrying written proof that she was not the villain somebody else had already typed her into becoming, and she still found a way, inside that letter, to write about tenderness, about naming, about light, about the kind of mother she hoped to be if the world stopped hitting long enough for her to try. That's what got through to Judge Judy, because outrage is easy in a courtroom, disappointment is easy, sarcasm is easy. What is rare is goodness under pressure. Elena had every excuse to become hard, every reason to expose everyone instantly, to lash out, to protect herself first, and let the rest of the family drown in the truth they had built. She didn't. She protected a frightened girl. She absorbed blame until it nearly buried her. She kept evidence, but not for revenge. She spoke only when silence became a danger to her child's future. And when she finally got the floor, she did not ask the court to destroy anyone. She only asked not to be turned into a lie. That is much harder than revenge. That is much rarer than innocence. And that is why the case ended the way it did. Not with applause, not with triumph, with understanding. A homeless pregnant woman walked into court carrying a sealed envelope because she thought she might lose before she was heard. She walked out with her name restored. And somewhere months later, a baby named Lucia Elena slept under a roof that did not depend on silence. That was more than a legal win. That was history corrected before it could harden. And for a judge who had spent years slicing through nonsense with common sense and steel, that was enough to bring tears to her eyes.